This week on Newsnight, the presidential race as new numbers show Republicans with a record voter registration advantage in Florida. Plus, Florida's Venezuelan community condemns President Maduro's crackdown on dissent. Newsnight starts now. Hello, I'm Steve Mort. Welcome to Newsnight, where we take a deep dive into the stories and issues that matter to Central Florida and how they shape our community. First tonight, Floridians will go to the polls in primary elections on Tuesday with early voting underway. But as Democrats prepare to hold their convention starting Monday, the presidential race will once again be front and center in the coming days. According to new figures, Republicans now have a large lead over Democrats in voter registration in Florida, which the GOP says is a sign of the changing political makeup of the state. But Democrats say it's an indication of successful Republican voter suppression in recent years. And they say they hope the Harris-Walz ticket will improve their chances of becoming competitive again in the Sunshine State. Well, I sat down this week with political scientist Patrick Rickert from Rollins College.
The Democrats have definitely been excited the past couple of weeks, and certainly that's helped them in some of the swingier states, but they still have quite a long way to go in Florida. Some recent polls that have come out since Harris became the nominee have shown former President Trump with about a 5 to 7 point lead. That's pretty hard to make up.
Those are much bigger gaps than we used to see in Florida just a few years ago.
Absolutely, and that gets at why Florida is such a risky state for Democrats to invest in right now. Not only is it expensive to buy campaign advertisements here, but it's quite a gamble that Florida will be a state that matters in terms of determining who wins the presidential election. There are a lot of states that are much closer and much easier for Democrats to justify spending money on.
How important do you think early voting and mail-in voting is going to be in Florida, given the momentum that we've seen certainly at the start of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz's campaign? Do you think it's going to be necessary for them to try to get people to the polls as early as possible in somewhere like Florida in order to kind of take advantage of any of that momentum that might be left?
Absolutely, especially with the Democratic National Convention coming up. Almost always we see a bump for campaigns coming after their convention. And some states have early voting that starts as early as next month. Florida is a bit later, but you're always on a race against the clock with these elections and trying to make sure your enthusiasm sticks by the time that the votes are actually cast. One thing that is beneficial for Democrats in Florida are, since President Biden stepped down, 18,000 volunteers have signed up to work on the Harris-Walz campaign. And that is something that is really helpful for establishing Democrats in Florida, because that's not a risk that the National Party is taking. People who are volunteering are not transferable. They're not deciding, oh, am I going to volunteer in Florida or Pennsylvania? They're only going to volunteer here. And so if Democrats want to boost their chances, it's going to be through those volunteers and organizing at the local level that doesn't require the National Party to take those risks.
Patrick Rickert from Rollins College there. Well, let's bring in our panel now to break it all down. Joining us in the studio this week, Eric Sandoval, investigative reporter at WKMG News 6. Thanks for coming in, Eric.
Good to be here.
Good to see you again.
Yeah.
Randy Hildreth for the first time from Fox 35. Nice to see you, Randy.
Nice to be here.
And Matthew Petty, favorite of the show from WUSF in Tampa. Good to see you as well, Matt. Thanks for coming in. Eric, let me start with you, if I can, and the news of the week on that growing voter registration gap.
Yeah.
I mean, how big a hole does it put the Democrats in here?
This is really interesting. I mean, you guys have to remember, a few years ago, it was the Battle of I-4 for any presidential race.
Yeah.
They were all here campaigning, but registration has shifted. I just checked the numbers yesterday. Republicans are 1 million registrants ahead of Democrats. But what I found interesting is the no party affiliation has pretty much stayed the same over the last 5 years.
I mean, the Democrats held an advantage in Florida for so many years.
Yeah, we have really seen the political landscape change very quickly here in Florida. 2020, when we look at registered voters, Democrats did have a slight edge over Republicans. But then fast forward, we talk about the very latest numbers, and people are looking at what has caused these shifts. I want to break down just a couple reasons. I think people would point to demographic shifts. So when Governor DeSantis got into office, people really resonated with some of the policies, the laws, and the promises.
During the COVID era,
yes,
especially.
during the COVID era, especially, really resonated with him wanting to keep the state open and operational, keeping schools open. And so I think you did have a wave of people who moved to Florida specifically to live in Florida and live in a state under Governor DeSantis. I think on the flip side, since COVID and what we've seen after that, you have had people who don't really like some of the policies, procedures, and promises that have come from his administration. And so progressives, for example, we have likely seen a shift of people leave the state. So potentially Republicans moving to Florida and Democrats leaving Florida. I think if you talk to Democrats specifically, they may point to some of the laws that have been passed recently, specifically about how parties or organizations work to register voters. And so they may argue that has stunted the work that they can do, and those organizations typically target college students, minorities who would skew Democrat. I think if you ask Republicans, it goes back to they are just believing that people are buying what they are selling.
I mean, is that what you're hearing as well? I mean, is it generally what Democrats would call, as I said before, voter suppression?
Yeah, I mean, you heard that at the start of the show, right?
Yeah.
That's what they're claiming. Nikki Fried, the chair of the Democratic Party of Florida, called it a systematic and coordinated effort of Republican voter suppression tactics. And she said millions of Democratic voters had been eliminated from the rolls in the past year. Just a note on that, though, I mean, according to the Florida Division of Elections last year, 268,521 active voters removed for a variety of reasons, and 16,827 inactive voters removed. So a big difference in those numbers there, but the Democrats are saying, well, you know, we are hoping to overcome that difference by this sort of surge in, I guess, enthusiasm since Kamala Harris launched her presidential campaign not too long ago, and sort of hope to turn that around.
Well, talking about that boost in popularity that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have seen since that ticket came together nationally, do we know beyond that how the presidential candidates currently stack up here?
Oh yeah, there's polls all over the place measuring this. One on July 30th, I have it here on a piece of paper from the University of North Florida's Public Opinion Research Lab. It shows Trump ahead by 7 points, 49 to 42. But then you factor in the margin of error there, it gets a little bit closer. You know, most of these polls have pretty much the same results. But, you know, when you hyper-focus on specific areas of Florida, let's say the Villages leans, you know, traditionally Republican. So you're going to have Trump ahead by a large margin in the Villages. But then you go south to Miami, you know, it's going to be Harris and Walz way ahead there. But here's the secret, though. You can poll all you want. And Republicans traditionally are really good at galvanizing their base and getting them to the polls. Democrats really struggle with that.
The Democrats' VP pick, Randy, Tim Walz, has been very critical of the DeSantis administration in the past, particularly, again, on that issue of COVID. What's he said, and how has the governor here responded to Walz?
We have seen back and forth during the pandemic, and Walz really being conservative and making sure that schools were shut down, very opposite of what we saw here and what was advocated for by Governor DeSantis. If we look at under Governor Walz's administration, what we've seen is lawmakers do codify abortion protections, protect gender-affirming care, allow undocumented citizens to get licenses. And we know that Walz is a former teacher, so he has had a lot to say about the back and forth here about whether AP African American Studies could be taught in schools and book bans. And as soon as Walz was announced as the vice presidential pick for the Democratic ticket, we saw DeSantis go to X and say this is an extreme left ticket, and I don't think the tit for tat will end anytime soon.
I mean, Kamala Harris, the top of the ticket, has also been highly critical of Florida, and we've seen her this year in the state making points that directly attack Governor DeSantis' position, particularly on things like abortion.
Yeah, I mean, she was in Jacksonville in May. This was just as Florida's new restrictions on abortion, the ban beyond 6 weeks with some exceptions rolled into effect. And really Harris and the Democrats, you see, trying to tie Trump to Florida's restrictions on abortion. I mean, You saw Vice President Harris referring to it as the Trump abortion ban when she came here. And also Randy brought up the teaching of African American history. That was something that Vice President Harris has been outspoken on too last year. She was also in Jacksonville about a year ago speaking about that. A big crowd at that particular event, which I guess kind of foreshadows a little bit of the enthusiasm we might have seen sort of latent, and that's kind of come to the fore since she's announced her candidacy. But yeah, these are issues where Democrats are really hoping to get some traction with voters here in Florida, particularly those no party affiliation voters and people who may, as you said, be kind of thinking that some of the policies that the DeSantis administration has rolled out have not been so popular.
And you guys just did a discussion in the community on abortion, and we'll put a link up to that on our website. Just want to mention really quickly the unions and hospitality, if I can. Unite Here represents thousands of hospitality workers across Florida. They've endorsed Kamala Harris. Do they say what their reasoning is?
She's very pro-union. One example is she's ensured an extraordinarily pro-union National Labor Relations Board and a general counsel. They credit her with saving the livelihoods of thousands of workers across the United States.
What about taxing on tips? That seems to have become an election issue now. Both candidates weighing in on this. Where do they stand?
Yeah, both appear to have found some common ground. We don't see that very often between former President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, but this, at least at base level, seems to be something that they both agree upon. Former President Trump has been campaigning on this issue since June. We just saw Harris come out with this recently at a campaign stop in Nevada, and we know that they mirror Central Florida in having a booming hospitality industry, well received.
Huge service sector, yes.
Certainly well received there, and so when we think about how that would translate to Central Florida, voters, roughly 270,000 hospitality workers in Central Florida, so it could be something that really resonates with folks here.
It's going to be a busy time for all of us, for sure, between now and November. Meanwhile, WUCF is committed to helping our community navigate the 2024 election by providing important information on how to vote and the races and questions on the ballot in our region. So we've partnered with public media outlets around the state, including Matt's outlet WUSF, to put together the 2024 Florida Voter Guide. It features detailed information on every state and federal race, including the candidates and their positions on key issues. Be sure to check it out at wucf.org/vote. Okay, next tonight, the investigation into an act of gun violence that has shocked the Lake County community of Eustis. Julie Sulpizio is accused of ambushing 3 deputies, killing 1 and injuring 2. Police say she sent officers to her home under the guise of conducting a well-being check, but instead they were met by a hail of gunfire from members of her family. Sulpizio faces multiple charges, including first-degree murder. We'll discuss the details in a moment, but first let's watch a piece Eric filed in the hours after the shooting earlier this month.
What I'd like to refer to them as, I can't. But we'll call them a family.
Lake County Sheriff Peyton Grinnell mincing no words today as he addressed an arrest after 3 of his deputies were ambushed inside this mobile home near Eustis over the weekend. Spokesman John Harrell told News 6 that investigators first encountered 48-year-old Julie Jefferson Sulpizio around 8 o'clock Friday night.
This lady then sent them to this house under the guise of conducting a well-being check. She said something to the effect that you need to go down to this house and check on the people there. So the deputies went down to this house, and it appeared that the house had been burglarized. In fact, they thought they had possibly a burglary in progress as they were posting up on that house. They could hear commotion inside. They tried to order the people out. No one came out. So at that point, they made entry into the home, at which time they were immediately met with heavy, heavy gunfire.
Harrell says the people shooting were the woman's husband, 49-year-old Michael Sulpizio, and his daughters, 23-year-old Cheyenne and 22-year-old Savannah. He says all 3 appeared to have shot themselves and died.
A search of the house showed gas mask, body armor, ghillie suits, medical bags, bug-out bags, MREs, and bottled water just stockpiled up.
Tonight, investigators are still trying to find out more about this family and what their motives for the shooting may have been. News 6 tracked down family members today conducting our own investigation. And we found out the last known interaction the Sulpizio family had with deputies was May of last year. Court records show deputies tried repeatedly to serve them with a foreclosure summons, but neither Julie or Michael was there to be served. That foreclosure was later dropped when they made arrangements to pay.
All right, Eric, well, we'll start with you on this one. You and the team at News 6 have been finding out much more about Julie Sulpizio since you put together that report. What have you been hearing?
Yeah, well, as you saw in our piece, we've been knocking on doors, trying to talk to the people who were directly and indirectly involved in this. And that day that we filed that story, I actually talked with Julie Sulpizio's mother. She came to the door, didn't have a camera with us. We just wanted to talk with her. And she said she spoke to her daughter in jail. She was still trying to piece together exactly why this happened. She admitted she hasn't spoken to her daughter in a while. She said she didn't know that they leaned towards anti-government views. But she was really, really just torn up because she lost two granddaughters in that, both of them taking their own lives.
Fox 35 has obviously been covering this closely as well. What do we know about the charges and the potential sentencing?
So we know that she faces 12 charges, 7 counts of premeditated murder, 4 counts of battery, 1 count of first-degree murder of a law enforcement officer. I want to focus on that one because that one is the heaviest, obviously. We know the state attorney says that this is a case that they could seek the death penalty. So in terms of timeline, since her arrest, 21 days before they convene or have to convene a grand jury, and then from that, 45 days to determine if they will seek the death penalty.
Well, so the death penalty could be on the table, Matt, which is interesting to note because Florida last year resumed executions, right, after a hiatus. The legislature also made significant changes to the state's law on capital punishment. Remind us what those changes were and what it means for sentencing in cases, capital cases, potentially like this one.
Yeah, there were some changes made last year, and it's important to note that this isn't the first time there's been some tinkering with the death penalty in Florida. But what happened was, back in 2023, Governor DeSantis signed a law that meant juries no longer have to be unanimous to recommend the death penalty. So that means the death penalty can be decided by an 8-4 majority in the jury, and that was prompted by the Parkland school shooting in 2018, where the shooter got a life sentence because the jury was not unanimous in recommending the death penalty. There's also some expansion of what cases are eligible for the death penalty, these capital cases. So, for example, it was expanded to include people convicted of sexual battery on children under the age of 12. And just from what I was saying before, back in 2016, the US Supreme Court struck down part of Florida's capital punishment system, saying it was unconstitutional for a judge to have the final say in handing down the death sentence. And then later in that same year, the Florida Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional for there to be a death penalty decided by a majority decision. In that case, it was 10-2 in the jury. So they had actually ordered resentencing for about 150 inmates on death row, and that was upended by the latest law change. So a lot of sort of back and forth here, which is complicated for people who are already on death row.
And we've definitely seen a lot of pushback in the courts, as you mentioned. Meanwhile, the trial in another high-profile shooting case is underway in Ocala. The manslaughter trial of Susan Lorenz, who is white, began on Tuesday. She's charged in the shooting last year of her neighbor, A.J. Owens, who is black, through a locked door. And Randy, I wanted to start with you on this one because obviously at Fox 35, you guys have been covering this closely. Remind us of the details and the background to that case and why it triggered so many protests at the time, including from civil rights activists.
Yeah, so this happened a little over a year ago, June 2023. And so to walk back to that day, neighbors, the family says that Owens's children were playing in an open field near Lorenz's home, and at one point, Lorenz allegedly threw skates at Owens's children, used racial slurs, and the children went back and told their mom. And at one point, the mom went to go confront Lorenz about what had happened and knocked on her door to try and confront her about what happened. During that confrontation, Lorenz shot through that locked front door, ultimately killing Owens. And in that moment, she claimed that it was self-defense, that she feared for her life. Well, there has been a lot of heartburn in the community, not just about what actually happened, but then in what happened after that shooting, subsequently. And so there was some concern about the time between when the shooting happened and when Lorenz was arrested. There were several days after the shooting before she was arrested, and investigators said they needed more time to look into the case because she said it was self-defense. Next, people were upset about the charge itself. Lorenz is charged with manslaughter. She could get 30 years in prison if she is found guilty, but a lot of people really wanted her to be charged with murder. And they felt that the prosecutor said that there wasn't enough evidence to show that there was ill will or hatred to get that murder charge, but people felt, considering the backstory and the friction between those neighbors, that she should have been charged with murder.
Well, let's just talk about that self-defense issue, and this brings up the issue of stand your ground, both in this state and other states. We know that stand your ground has been a controversial law in Florida, particularly since the killing of Trayvon Martin in Sanford all those years ago. This does kind of reignite the debate over stand your ground that has been consistently used in shooting cases.
That's right. I mean, stand your ground has been in effect since 2005, so it has been a law on the Florida books for some time. 2012, of course, was the shooting of Trayvon Martin, a teenager, by George Zimmerman. And there have been several attempts to roll back stand your ground. Now, South Florida State Senator Chevron Jones had the latest attempt. He wanted to effectively replace the stand your ground with a duty to retreat from a deadly confrontation if it could be done so safely. That was some legislation that he was hoping to get through. It wouldn't have stopped people from using deadly force if they believed they had to, and in any case, it didn't go anywhere. I should note too that, you know, although stand your ground is kind of associated with the shooting of Trayvon Martin, it wasn't actually used as a defence in that case, but it just sort of helped highlight that law and its use in Florida.
There was a big hearing during that trial, and I think that's when everybody's eyes sort of locked in on stand your ground.
And the popularity of stand your ground laws has increased exponentially in states around the country. I just want to finish off, Eric, by talking about the jury and the composition of that jury in the case in Ocala. What do we know about that, and what's the controversy?
You know, sort of dovetailing off what we were talking about earlier with the heartburn of the community afterwards and outside the community, we have a jury now seated who is all white in Ocala, and I think a lot of people are looking at that just with a raised eyebrow, saying, you know, what's going on there? 3 were gun owners, 3 had ties to law enforcement. They're middle-aged, have kids of their own, but you know, I think the testimony is what's going to be most poignant in this, and so far we've heard testimony from neighbors and even Owen's children in this. So the trial continues. We'll wait and see what the jury decides.
And certainly all our outlets, I'm sure, will be following it closely, but that's all the time we've got for now. My thanks to Eric Sandoval, WKMG News 6. Thanks for being here, Eric. Randy Hildreth from Fox 35 and Matthew Petty from WUSF. Thank you guys so much for coming in. Really appreciate it today. In the meantime, we'll be right back. All right, finally tonight, Venezuela's disputed election and the response from Florida's large Venezuelan community. Venezuelans last month appeared to handily reject President Nicolas Maduro at the polls in favor of opposition leader Edmundo González Urrutia. But the government-controlled electoral authority declared Maduro the winner with 52% of the vote, triggering street protests and a police crackdown. Maduro was previously sworn in 2019, following another election that scores of countries declared as illegitimate. Well, my colleague Crystal Knowles has been following what the US calls Venezuela's slide towards dictatorship, and she joins me in the studio now. Good to see you today, Crystal. You spoke with someone who fled Venezuela a few years ago. How do they view the situation there now?
Yeah, Roberto Perez and his family fled to Florida and they were granted temporary protective status. They said after this election, they're expecting to see another wave of people trying to leave the country. However, it's getting increasingly difficult for people to leave right now.
What I have heard from people, not only from my family, but from friends, very close friends, and what is said is that if they won and stayed in power, these people hate dictatorship. The migratory wave was going to be equal to or greater than what has already happened. That is, the United States, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Europe, wherever. The conditions are not livable. In Venezuela right now, you can't live. You can't live on $4 or $5 or $10 a month.
Yeah, Roberto Perez there. Well, the US State Department says it'll work with international partners to try to help restore democracy in Venezuela. You spoke with a community organization of Central Florida's Venezuelan community. Are they optimistic that the State Department and others can foment that kind of change? Do they have hope?
Yeah, so I spoke to Casa de Venezuela founder William Diaz, and he says we might see an influx of immigrants coming to the United States after the election, but he's hoping with more international support, the transfer of power might actually occur this time.
The administration have been telling Maduro what he might expect. I mean, he do not recognize that he lost and he gotta leave the country. But if we maintain the fight and if the international community assume their role, I guarantee you that a lot of people will want return to Venezuela.
William Diaz there. Well, what about the broader issue of corruption that has sort of led to these disputed elections? There are efforts, aren't there, by a Florida-based organization to return what people say are stolen assets that the regime there has taken away, they say, from people who live there. We've seen these claims as well in Cuba, where people have tried to recover their assets. You talked to a Florida-based group that says it wants to help in that recovery effort. What did you learn?
Yes, so I got the chance to speak to Maria Alejandra Marquez. She's the founder. Now, she says there's a lot of corrupt Venezuelan politicians or former politicians living right here in the U.S. that have stolen billions of dollars, and they're hoping to recover that. Now, their plan is to create legislation aimed at recovering those assets and giving back to the Venezuelan people.
We have currently a bill introduced in the Senate, which is called the PANA Act. In the previous Congress, we managed to get the bills introduced in both chambers. We're looking towards introducing the second one in the House and see if we can get it approved before the year's end.
Well, let's see if that happens. Crystal Knowles, thank you so much for your reporting. Really appreciate it today. You can find much more of Crystal's reporting on this issue, including content in Spanish, on our website. Visit us online at wcf.org/newsnight along the bottom of your screen. But that is all the time we have for this week. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 here on WCF. In the meantime, from all of us here at Newsnight, take care and have a great week.